He preaches extends a call to the congregation, but we're going to begin our service today by extending a call. A lot of it's going to be up on the screen here, and if you want a better view of what's on the screen, we want to invite you to come down a little closer to the front for our Sabbath school time. So if that's what you would like to do, this would be a good time to do it. Come on down here and we'll get started. It's good that we got the latter rain today. So it's perfect timing. You know, I was thinking about the Sabbath School quarterly that we just came through, the great controversy. How many really enjoyed this quarter Sabbath School? Wasn't that wonderful? And so much of what was in our Sabbath School was references to writings of someone who was given to our church as a gift. The Lord blessed a certain person and thus a certain group of people through the ministry of Ellen White. And I think it's fitting that this Sabbath we're kind of dedicating it to the spirit of prophecy and how the Bible talks about the gospel and the second coming of Jesus. But what great gift we have where some of those gaps that are in the Bible can be easily filled in with the spirit of prophecy. I'm happy to introduce a friend of mine. He is Dr. Jud Lake. He comes to us from Southern Adventist University. He graduated from Bass Memorial Academy. We marched the same day, the same time. It was good. We enjoyed it. Our time at Bass, we became friends there, and then off to seminary. And Jud pastored in this conference after seminary, several districts, over in Gilbertown, over in Jackson. I had the privilege of following him in Jackson there. And then, of course, he went on to academic studies where he was also then became the professor of religion at Southern Adventist University. So I'll give a full, extensive introduction at the worship hour. But let's just say a hearty amen welcome to Dr. Jud Lake.
You, Roger.
Thank you for being here.
Yes, sir. My pleasure. Great to be here. My wife still, is that the rain roaring outside? Yeah, my wife is sitting in the car, and I text her. I said, starting. I have a feeling she's not going to come in right now.
Oh, we can fix that. We can go get a number.
So glad to be here with you. Glad to see my good friend Roger. We had many fun times at Bass, and then at college, and then pastoring. Oh, you have to tell him some of the pranks we pulled on the administration. You remember that with Jim Greek? Oh, okay. Yes, we had some great times. Such a pleasure to be here. And it's a pleasure to talk with you about the prophetic ministry of Ellen G. White. And so this morning, my focus will be on the personal side of Ellen White. What she was like as a person. We tend to view her with the supernatural element, the prophetic gift. But what was she really like as a human being? Sometimes we think that prophets of the Bible and people with the prophetic gift like Ellen White, they float 3 feet off the ground. And they live differently from the rest of us, and they're separate from sin. No, that's not the case at all. They were genuine human beings. And so I want to answer the question this morning, will the real Ellen White please stand? There are so many false misrepresentations of Ellen White, misunderstandings of Ellen White, within Adventism and without, and there's a large movement of former Adventists who have left Seventh-day Adventism, and one of the major areas that they devote their life to attacking is Ellen White, the person of Ellen White. So many misunderstandings. But what was she really like? It's important for us who affirm her prophetic gift to really know what she was like as a person. Interestingly, she's a forgotten figure of history. At least she has been. And by that I mean in terms of historians of religious history in America. They really haven't heard much about Ellen White other than, well, she's the prophet of the Adventist church. But in recent years, scholars, historians outside of the Adventist community have developed an interest in religious figures, religious leaders in the 19th century. And Ellen White has been one of them. I was at a conference some years ago where there was a gathering of Adventist scholars and historians and former Adventist historians, and then historians totally outside of the Adventist community. They were all very interested in Ellen White. And for several days we had papers and discussion, and actually a book came out of that conference. But it was fascinating to see how interested historians of religious history in America outside of the Adventist community are interested in Ellen White. Now, they don't accept her prophetic gift, but they're interested in learning about her, and that's a good thing. So she has been a forgotten figure of history, but that's changing. But we want to look at the real person of Ellen White this morning. I want to tell you some stories about her, what she was like. She was more than just someone with the prophetic gift. She was indeed a visionary. She was a church leader, a public speaker, a prolific author. That's how we generally know her. But we forget that she was a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother, a granddaughter, and a friend. Roger fixed this thing, and now it's broke again. It's dangling on my ear. I had many of these things over the years, and some fit and some don't. Maybe that'll do it. She had some extraordinary experiences of seeing heavenly things. We, of course, are aware of her inaugural prophetic vision in December of 1844, following the disappointment. That was the beginning of her prophetic ministry of over 1,000 visions up until her death in 1915. But what was she like as a human being? The real Ellen White. Let's first of all look at her family background. Her parents, her siblings. She was parents of British ancestry, a sturdy New England stock. There had been some conjecture that she may have had some African American background. And there's been a lot of study on that, and that's fine if that were the case. The White estate did several genealogical studies and concluded that she's clearly from a sturdy New England stock, but if in the future it were found that there were a mixture of that, that's, of course, fine. We just wanted to get the facts right. Her father, Robert Harmon, he was a farmer. Ellen was born in Gorham, Maine, and her father on a farm. But then they moved to Portland, Maine, and that's where he got into the hat-making business, and he did pretty well with that. Her mother was Eunice Gould Harmon. That's where we get the Ellen G. in Ellen G. White, Ellen Gould Harmon. They were members of the Portland, Maine Chestnut St. Methodist Church. Robert was a deacon there. This church still stands. It is now a restaurant. Years ago, when I was conducting Adventist heritage tours with my students, it was still a church, and we could go and see it. But now it's a restaurant, so you don't want to take people to tour a restaurant like a church. But they, interestingly, Adventist scholars a couple of decades ago were doing research, and in the basement of this church, they found a big box full of records. And they searched through those records, and they found during the peak year of the Millerites in 1843, they found the individual groups who were disfellowshipped. You might recall in the Millerite messages, it escalated and got right down to the wire when Miller was saying that Jesus is coming on a certain date. Up to that point, preachers had embraced William Miller because he was a church growth agent. But when he began to really focus on the date, they began to back off, and they started to disfellowship Millerites. And we found that the very first Millerite family to be disfellowshipped in the church was the Harmon family. Young Ellen and her family, they were the first ones to be brought before the board and disfellowshipped because of accepting the Millerite theological positions. And that was very difficult for the family. The children, they lost all of their friends. It was an embarrassing, humiliating, sad experience for the Whites. One of Ellen's siblings really took it hard and left Christianity because of that. And I'll tell you who that is here in just a moment. So she had 5 sisters, including a twin, and 2 brothers. Her oldest sister was Caroline Harmon. She married in the Clove family. She was the wife of a Methodist clergyman. Of course, Ellen grew up in the Methodist Episcopal Church, and it's no surprise that several of the sisters married Methodist ministers. And that is something very important in Ellen White's background for understanding her theological ideas and themes in her writings. She was Wesleyan to the core. John Wesley was her mentor. She grew up learning about John Wesley, the Methodist Episcopal Church. That was the American version of John Wesley's church. And John Wesley was a great man of God and a major player in the continuing Reformation. And so she mentored a lot. If you read the book Steps to Christ, it has Wesleyan themes all through it. Of course, biblical themes, because Wesley followed the Bible, but you can see Wesley's influence there. And that's really important in understanding where Adventism fits in terms of religious traditions. I tell my students, somebody ask you, what's the tradition of Seventh-day Adventists? Well, it's technically Wesleyan Arminian. We follow in the footsteps of Jacob Arminius and John Wesley. So that historical background is interesting. Arminius, he rejected John Calvin's predestination, which is the spin-off of that today is where you get the once saved, always saved ideas. And Wesley and Arminius, they resisted that and recognized that the gospel not only saves you, it transforms you. And you want to be in a loyal relationship with God. And Ellen White followed this. And that's why faith and works go together. So that historical background is most interesting. But here's a fascinating feature with Caroline. Here's a picture of Ellen at age 44, Caroline at age 60. In the early years of her prophetic ministry, sharing her visions, her sisters would travel with her and encourage her and help her. But they never became Seventh-day Adventists. A couple did, as I'll get to in a moment, but the majority of them did not. Caroline never became an Adventist. But years later, when Ellen had was a part of the established Seventh-day Adventist church, her sister had not embraced the three angels message and the Sabbath, remained a Methodist. And Ellen White said, we have different views on things, but our hearts are one. And of Caroline, she wrote in one of the letters, she said, Caroline, your gift is singing. My gift is speaking. Ellen was like me. She couldn't sing. She made a noise intended to be joyful, okay? But the family was very close, and even though they had these differences, Ellen White affirmed the Christian experience of her sisters. I'm pausing to let that sink in. Her sisters, Caroline, did not embrace the Seventh-day Sabbath and the three angels' messages. But as far as we can tell, though, in the correspondence between them, Ellen believed Caroline and her other sisters had a genuine relationship with Jesus and expected to see them in heaven. I find this to be a very important lesson for us Seventh-day Adventists. And Ellen White leads the way, and this is something that she would do the rest of her life. While she said some very strong things about the Protestant world and disobedience to God's law, at the same time she believed that in the Protestant world there were many, many sincere Christians. And she believed that they would be in heaven, even though there were differences. She believed her sisters would be in heaven. What does that say to us, how we relate to our brothers and sisters in the Baptist churches, in the Presbyterian churches, in the Methodist churches, in the Congregational churches, and even the Pentecostal churches, and the Catholic churches? What a lesson that is. I'm not suggesting compromising our faith at all, but recognizing she would say years later that we need to find areas that we have in common and connect with Christians on this, such as the full authority of Scripture and salvation through Christ alone and the second coming, and affirm those areas that we do connect with. And that's the best witness. I tell my students in my Adventist Heritage classes, if you really want to witness, sometimes more powerful than giving a Bible study is just being a friend and loving somebody as they are. That's the most powerful witness. And that's what can really bring people to Christ and into the church. And we learn that example from Ellen White. She led the way in how to relate to Christians outside of our own Christian tradition. Sometimes we need to maybe think of not so much as converting them to our way of thinking, but as being there for them and loving them as they are. That's a lesson we get from Ellen White. And after that, out of that context, will emerge those opportunities to share the joy of the Sabbath and what the second coming of Christ is really like and going to be like, and what the judgment is really about, and all of these great truths that God has given us, that they should be shared out of the context of a relationship. Harriet Harmon married in the McCann family. She was also the wife of a Methodist clergyman. John Harmon, he was a businessman in Illinois. Mary Plummer Harmon Foss. She's the only sister that accepted Seventh-day Adventist belief, or I should say, the only sister that accepted the Seventh-day Adventist beliefs but never became a baptized member. And that was, by the way, the same with her parents. Ellen's parents, they actually embraced the Sabbath. They embraced a number of things, but they died before Adventism became Seventh-day Adventism. At this point, in the years following the disappointment, they were called Sabbatarian Adventist, or just Adventist. And her parents died before there was an official Seventh-day Adventist church, but had they lived, they probably would have become Seventh-day Adventist. Sarah Harmon Belden did become a Seventh-day Adventist. And Robert Harmon, also her only brother to become a Seventh-day Adventist, he died of consumption at age 27. Consumption was the 19th century euphemism for what we know today as tuberculosis. You got that? I mean, you were, another 19th century euphemism is marked for the grave. You're going to die. And Ellen actually had this, but she was healed from it. But she was really close to this brother, and when he died, she grieved a long time because they had a special, close relationship. And her twin, Elizabeth, who she called Lizzie, that was her fraternal twin. Lizzie married a Quaker, but Lizzie never accepted Ellen's gift, and she eventually left Christianity and married the Quaker, who was really an inactive Quaker, so they really didn't go to church. This was something that brought a lot of grief to Ellen's heart, and she would minister to her sister over the years. And later on this morning, I'm going to share with you how she, on her sister's deathbed, Lizzie's deathbed, Ellen was attempting to lead her to Christ. I'll share some excerpts from that here in a moment. Here is a picture of Ellen and her twin, and her twin sister Lizzie. Little bit of difference in the nose, you'll notice. We'll get to the accident that reconfigured Ellen White's nose a little bit. Ellen's in the standing position. Lizzie is sitting. That's because Ellen was known by this time as a speaker. So she was to stand in a picture was a more authoritative position. So it's interesting, a little bit of the background to these type of things. At age 9, Ellen Harmon suffered a tragic accident, which she later wrote was to affect my whole life. She was struck in the nose by a stone hurled by a classmate. If you've grown up in the Adventist church, which I'm sure you have, you've heard this story. She and one of her sisters, they were walking after school home. They were taking a shortcut. She'd had a little argument with a girl, and they were trying to get away. It got a little bit heated, as children can do, and she was attempting to get away. And she turned around to see where the girl was, and the girl had thrown a stone, probably intending just to scare him, not to hit him. But her aim evidently was off, and as Ellen turned, it hit her right in the face, and she was knocked out cold. She recalled a little bit later on that she woke up in a grocery store and just glanced down and saw blood all over her garments. And then she lost consciousness. But she was later told that her sister and probably the girl, we think, who threw the stone, who threw the stone, helped carry her home. They picked her up and helped walk her home. She was, thank you, she was in and out of it. And Normally, she would have been taken to a hospital today on a stretcher like that. So probably the movement, walking her home, intensified the accident, and she basically fell into a coma for about 3 months. And so she remembered, I think I'll keep this up here. She was told what was happening during that time. And she was in a coma for 3 weeks. And she was in what they called a great cradle, constructed especially for her, many additional weeks. She said, "I was reduced almost to a skeleton. Her personal physician and family did not expect her to live. They said she was marked for the grave." Remember that? Marked for the grave. They believed that she was going to die. Convinced that she was dying, the young 9-year-old Ellen gave her heart to Jesus in simple faith. Several months later, on January 25, 1837, a dramatic aurora borealis, the northern lights as we call them, that lit up the sky. I did some research on this, and the newspapers at the time, this was a particularly brilliant manifestation of the lights, and it terrified everyone. They believed it was the end of the world. Young Ellen had just embraced Jesus, and so she thought, this is the second coming of Jesus. And she asked her mother to carry her to the window, and her mother took her to the window, and she recalled hearing screams from the neighbors. People thought that it was the end of the world, but for young Ellen, for her, it was the second coming of Jesus. She clapped her hands, and she waited. She had been in such pain and suffering, and it was now going to end, and the hours went by, and the lights faded, and Jesus didn't come. She later wrote, "I was disappointed. The singular appearance faded from the heavens, and the next morning the sun arose the same as usual." Well, this plunged the young Ellen into depression. The prospect that she must continue living in the midst of her suffering extinguished her short-lived childlike joy. Over the next 4 years, she struggled with discouragement and chronic depression. Because of her poor health, she could not return to school and gave up her hope of an education, something she very much desired. If she probably would have been diagnosed with clinical depression during this time. People don't realize this about Ellen, but she really struggled emotionally as a young girl. Very sensitive conscience. Years later, I'm going to jump ahead real quick and then come back to this, but years later she was traveling on a train. And a woman tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Is your name Ellen Harmon?" She said, "Yes, Ellen Harmon White now." She says, "I remember you. We were in school in Portland, Maine together. And I remember every time the teacher wanted somebody to read, she'd call on you. Because you were the best reader in the class." See, Ellen loved school. She did well in school. But now, she couldn't go back to school because of her injury. And that really plunged her into discouragement and depression. She was a smart girl. We sometimes say that she lacked a formal education. We need to recognize that Ellen White became self-educated. She read and studied her Bible. She read other books. That's an important issue when you come to the plagiarism charge. I'm not going to discuss that. Plenty of stuff I can share with you online about that. If that's a question that you ever, maybe the Q&A, we can talk about that this afternoon. But she read a lot. But she missed going to school. She missed her formal education. She said, "I was unreconciled to my lot, and at times murmured against the providence of God in thus afflicting me." Her conscience was unusually sensitive, and she experienced strong feelings of guilt over her resentment. Her simple faith in Jesus disappeared, and she was left in darkness. We've identified 3 phases to Ellen White's conversion. The first phase is her simple acceptance of Jesus after the accident. But then she lost that through all this darkness, and we'll get to the second phase in a moment. But this feeling of discouragement, it was compounded by her belief in an eternally burning hell, which exacerbated her fear and agony of soul. I mentioned the Wesley, John Wesley, and that tradition that she grew up in. There's many wonderful ideas in the Wesleyan tradition that are very biblical, that Ellen was influenced by. But unfortunately, they espoused eternal burning hell. And that just intensified her feelings because she didn't feel worthy before God. She would write on that experience and reflect on it. And here's what she said, years later, reflecting back on this belief in eternal hell. In my mind, the justice of God eclipsed His mercy and love. The mental anguish I passed through at this time was very great. I had been taught to believe in an eternally burning hell, and as I thought of the wretched state of the sinner without God, without hope, I was in deep despair. I feared that I should be lost and that I should live throughout eternity a living death. The horrifying thought that was ever before me, that my sins were too great to be forgiven, that I should be forever lost. When the thought took possession of my mind that God delighted in the torture of His creatures who were formed in His image, a wall of darkness seemed to separate me from Him. When I reflected that the Creator of the universe would plunge the wicked into hell, there to burn through the ceaseless rounds of eternity, my heart sank with fear. And I despaired that so cruel and tyrannical a being would ever condescend to save me from the doom of sin. I thought that the fate of the condemned sinner would be mine, to endure the flames of hell forever, even as long as God Himself existed. Almost total darkness settled upon me, and there seemed no way out of the shadows. So there is a very discouraged young girl, and the belief in hell only intensified it. Years later, when she would reject the teaching of eternal burning hell, what a relief that was. But until that time, it was assurance in Jesus that gave her the hope. But we're not to that second part of her conversion yet. In addition to this idea of hell, she read devotional books from the church library that described little girls as living saintly lives, free from doubts and sins and weaknesses. That was an interesting 19th century feature. The literature about children depicted them as perfect little beings, obeying their parents in everything. And of course, parents knew otherwise. But Ellen, in her childish mind, believed that's how a child should be. She took it literally. And she felt, I don't measure up to this. So that plunged her into deeper darkness. Fortunately, a breakthrough in her spiritual experience occurred at the Buxton, Maine Methodist Camp meeting late in the summer of 1841. Upon hearing a convicting sermon on salvation, righteousness by faith, she cried out to God for salvation. Interestingly, if you read in history some of the great Christians, the great leaders in the Christian faith, great preachers, they usually pinpoint their conversion to hearing a sermon. The great conversions in church history are based on preaching. And that was what we see right here with Ellen White. A sermon on salvation convicted her. This is the beginning of the second phase of her conversion experience. She reached out to God for salvation. And she reflected on that experience and wrote, "As I knelt and prayed, suddenly my burden left me. My heart was light. I can never forget this precious assurance of the pitying tenderness of Jesus towards one so unworthy of His notice." I bolded the word precious assurance. That's where Ellen White found for the first time assurance in Christ. And that experience of assurance would continue for the rest of her life. In my book, Ellen White Under Fire, I have 5 pages devoted to Ellen White's statements, starting with this one at her conversion experience, that go throughout her entire life. And you see the evidence that she believed that the Christian can have assurance. She spoke about assurance for others. She spoke about her own assurance, as she does here. Assurance of salvation is crucial for Christian experience. And it began in Ellen White's experience right here. The culmination of her conversion, the third phase, we would call it, was a counseling session in 1843 initiated by her mother with an Adventist Methodist minister named Levi Stockman. Stockman was a major Millerite leader, preacher. And so Ellen White was hearing about him as a Millerite and greatly respected him, and a mother felt that Stockman might be able to reach young Ellen. In her newfound faith, she was seeking God's will for her life, and so she met with Stockman, and that was a turning point for her. Stockman was a wise man of God. By the way, he was dying of consumption or tuberculosis, and so was Ellen White. They both coughed through this interview. Of course, Ellen would be healed. Stockman eventually died of consumption. It consumed him. But in that conversation, he said, as he listened to her share her experience, and she actually had experienced several dreams. I'm going to look at my time here because I get into these stories and I can go too long. We go till 10:30, Roger? Okay, I got to watch my time. She had several dreams, not prophetic dreams, but just dreams where she had seen Jesus. It was speaking to her personally. And she shared that with Stockman, and he looked at her, and she remembered him saying, Ellen, God has something special in store for you. God has His hand upon your life, and you can trust Him. He's leading you somewhere. He's going to do something special and great with you. And those words really impacted her significantly. And after that meeting with Stockman, she went to a prayer meeting. Now, this was the old Methodist prayer meeting. Now, folks, this was the shouting Methodist experience. Okay? This is what we would look at and say, that's charismatic. All these people jumping up and down and all this shouting and waving of hands. Well, that was Ellen's early experience, some of the early Methodist revival. The Methodists were probably one of the most revivalist of the traditions, and they swept across the northern countryside. And they were called the Shouting Methodist. And so that's part of Ellen's young experience. Of course, she would move away from the shouting part, right? But that was a part of this early experience. But that prayer meeting, coupled with that meeting with Stockman, confirmed in her experience that the power of God was in her life. And during that time, she was attending meetings by William Miller. And she was greatly encouraged by Miller's preaching. And then, of course, all of this experience, by now she had been through all three phases of her conversion. She was strong in the Lord and able to bear the trials of the Millerites. And the greatest trial, the day of disappointment when Jesus didn't come. You know, we have a lot of writings about Millerite leaders and what happened during that day, and then their great disappointment when Jesus didn't come and how they felt. Ellen doesn't say a lot about that, about the details of what she was doing that day. But years later, she would refer to that experience, the passing of the time. That's how she called it, the passing of the time. It was prophetic time, as she would understand years later. She made it through the Millerite disappointment. She was 16 years old during the disappointment in October 22, 1844. In November, she turned 17. And it was in December that she had her inaugural vision where she saw the people of God walking on the narrow path, as you see. I spent an hour lecture with my students discussing all the rich theological ideas behind that vision. So, of course, we can't get into it this morning, but that was the inaugural visionary experience that officially began her prophetic ministry. So I need to move on and we'll walk through her life now. Here is a picture of her in her early 30s. Here is the earliest picture we have of James and Ellen. They started seeing each other through traveling. James heard about her visionary experience. He had been a major Millerite preacher. He had baptized 1,000 people. He was responsible for at least 1,000 people that converted to the Millerite movement. So James White was a great Millerite evangelist. And he heard of Ellen's visions, and he would travel separate from her sisters, because it would have been scandalous for a man to travel if he weren't married in those days with a woman. So he and Ellen kept their distance, but they caught their eyes, and they began to talk with one another, and they developed a relationship, and they thought they should get married, but then they decided not to because Jesus was coming. Then, after time, they realized, you know what? We can do a lot more for the Lord together if we're married. And so they got married. At the time, he was 25 years old and she was 18 years old. They had a simple wedding before a justice of the peace. I had the privilege of serving just a couple of years ago on a committee for a doctoral dissertation. I was one of the external examiners. And this doctoral dissertation was about the marriage of James and Ellen White. And of course, I had that's why I was asked to be on it, because I've studied her life and so forth. But I learned so much by analyzing the work of the scholar and engaging in the doctoral defense as one of the external examiners. But I learned so many details about the marriage. And their marriage was one where it was mission-oriented. They were in love, yes. They had 4 children. We'll get to that in a moment. But it was mission-oriented. The mission of the church was the domineering factor in that relationship. But also, and I had studied this already before, but this dissertation work of the scholar in the dissertation clarified it, that James and Ellen, there came a point in their marriage where they really had some struggles. They had a good marriage, but every marriage has its struggles, right? Any marriage in this church not have any struggles? I didn't think so. But this was really a challenge. James was a workaholic, and over the years it affected his health, and he had several minor strokes. It affected his personality. You get to the 1870s, and there's a series of letters where Ellen White is writing her best friend Lucinda at the time. And she shares with Lucinda, she confides in Lucinda the struggles she was having with James. Now, she was on the West Coast writing on the life of Christ at the time. James was back in Battle Creek on the East Coast. He was writing to her in a series of letters telling her to come back and let's go to camp meeting together. And she had felt stressed out about their relationship. I think I've got time to read a little bit of these excerpts for you. I have the whole set of the letters. These letters are very interesting. These letters she wrote to her friend Lucinda. Here's an excerpt of what she wrote. So James is telling her, come back east and let's do camp meeting tour together. Should I come east? James' happiness might suddenly change to complaining and fretting. She's writing to Lucinda this now. I am thoroughly disgusted with the state of things and do not mean to place myself where the least liability of its occurring. I must work as God should direct. God in His providence has given us each to do our work, and we will do it separately, independently. He is happy, I am happy, but the happiness might all change should we meet. So, anybody relate to that? There were some struggles. In fact, this was a little bit of an intentional separation at the time because the intensity of things. A great share, but it discouraged her. Listen, a great share of my life's usefulness has been lost. I cannot have confidence in James' judgment in reference to my duty. He seems to want to dictate to me as though I were a child. And then James, in one of the letters he wrote back, and he was writing about his duty and the way his wife had described his duty. And he says, I will use the good old head God gave me until He reveals that I am wrong. Your head won't fit my shoulders. Keep it where it belongs. I will try to honor God and use my own. I shall be glad to hear from you, but don't waste your precious time and strength lecturing me on matters of mere opinions. He's writing to the prophetess. Okay? So they were real people. They had struggles. That's just an excerpt from a series of letters. Ellen was confiding this to her friend Lucinda. But then we find, shortly after this, we find a letter she wrote to Lucinda, and she says, Lucinda, I'm summarizing, I am sorry I shared with you what I did. I should not have done that. Christ is the great burden bearer. I should have taken it to Him. Lucinda, I'm sorry. Lucinda, burn these letters. Burn these letters. Now, here's an interesting little historical fact. Lucinda, of course, did not burn those letters, but these were separate from all the other letters. In almost like a century later, this is 1876. In the mid-1970s, about 1975 or 1976, all those letters had been kept in the family, and other letters too, and they gave them to the White estate. And the White estate went through all those letters and, of course, categorized them and authenticated them, that they were genuine. Now the question is, but didn't Ellen White ask Lucinda to burn those letters? But the White estate didn't burn them. They kept them. And then people like me are sharing the contents openly when Ellen White said to Lucinda, please burn them. Would you like me to leave now? Well, if you look at Ellen White's will at the end of her life, she meant for the White estate to be stewards of her writings, which means she gave them the authority to choose how to use those writings and to share what is best. And the White estate, and I agree with them, felt that these letters could be a real help to married couples in marriage that are having struggles in their marriage. Because I'm not finished with the story yet. After writing Lucinda and apologizing to Lucinda, Ellen White wrote to her husband James and apologized to James. It's beautiful. I don't have time to read it. Beautiful letter. She apologized to James. Within a month, she was back in the East. And they were working together. And they stayed in love until he died in 1881. What a testimony that is. Today, people have a few struggles in marriage and they get divorced. But they stayed together in spite of their trials. So the White estate has felt that those letters can really help people today to show that people as significant as James and Ellen White still had real earthy struggles in their relationships. And yet, they realized the magic words that can often save a marriage, save a relationship. 6 magic words. I'm sorry, I was wrong. I'm sorry, I was wrong. So, with real people, struggles, yet they remained married and they did a great work for God. And they had 4 children. Here she is in her late 30s, and I am hitting the wrong button, sorry. So here's the children. The youngest child, John Herbert, died in 1860 at age 2.5 from erysipelas, a terrible disease. And the interesting story behind this, he was born during crucial meetings in the fall of 1860 when they were coming together and deciding on organizing. This is when they first chose the name Seventh-day Adventist for the church. And so it was a very crucial meeting. After the meeting, now Ellen brought this newborn there, and they hadn't chosen a name. They weren't sure what to name the child. They were too focused on naming the church. So they went through the meetings, and James had to travel right afterward. And I should add the interesting context, step back and make it and look at it, the larger context. In the fall, it was a major presidential election in the United States. And Abraham Lincoln was elected president. And South Carolina seceded from the Union. The beginning of the Civil War. So a lot of things were happening. So James traveled. Ellen kept the baby. You have the letters back and forth. And she would write to James. She would write to friends. The nameless one is doing well today. The little nameless one is not feeling well. And she wrote to one of her friends, please send us a name. Well, they finally chose the name John Herbert, but unfortunately John Herbert died. James came back. He himself had to conduct the funeral. So there were many challenging times for our pioneers. Their oldest son was the youngest, Henry. Henry was a very gifted young man. He died at age 16. Henry could sing. When he died, Ellen said often, oh, how we miss our sweet singer. To lose a child at that age is just, you could only imagine the grief. It was very difficult for them. But Henry, on his deathbed, he asked for his friends to come, and he attempted to lead them to Christ, to appeal to them to accept Christ. Now, one interesting story is during the early years of the Civil War. This is earlier in 1862, before he became ill. He was gifted as a musician, and he could whistle. And in Battle Creek, that's where the soldiers would come to train and march before they go down the south to battle. And it was close to where the whites lived. And the children, Henry and Edson, who I'll get to in a moment, they were fascinated by soldiers and battles. And they would make bow and arrows and shoot birds and pretend that they were in battle. And they would sing the soldier songs. And then the friends of James and Ellen were concerned about their sons, how interested they were in the war and battle. And Henry one day went down to watch the soldiers march. And they had what were called fifes, little boys, maybe you've seen pictures of this, drummers and fifes with their flutes. They would march into battle with the soldiers, and their music would help them keep the cadence. Of course, they, as you know, especially the earlier Civil War, they used the Napoleonic straight lines. That's what caused so many casualties marching into battle. And so it was these boys that would march with them, and often these little boys would die. Well, the fifes were playing, and Henry began to whistle louder than the fifes. And the commander stopped. He told the fifes to not play anymore. And for about an hour, this column of soldiers marched to Henry's whistling. He was so impressed with that, he went back home and he told the family he wants to join the Union Army. You can imagine how that conversation went. Well, James eventually just moved his family out of Battle Creek for a while till the war was over. Every American was affected by the Civil War, including the whites. So a little bit of history about Henry, and he died of pneumonia. They had no cure for that at the time. In fact, years later, once they found a cure for the viruses and bacteria in the latter part of the century, Ellen White was wringing her hands and told one of her daughters-in-law, if only we would have had this with Henry. We could have saved Henry. So the loss of children is something that she grieved about the rest of her life. And here is the family in the conclusion of the Civil War. The children so she had four. The two died, Henry and Herbert. And then we have little Willie and we have Edson who left. Just a little bit about these boys. Edson was the, what shall we say? Edson was the bad boy. He never did anything his mother wanted him to do. She talked about reading, the danger of reading the dime novels, cheap soap opera type, what we call today novels and things like jewelry. Edson, anything his mother said not to do, he did it. She talked about humility of dress. He got one time saved up like a month's salary, bought a real fancy jacket and a watch with a chain link on it, which was considered jewelry. And he marched or paraded up in front of the Review and Herald office with that. And he would sit in church. His mother said he would sit in church next to her, prop his feet up on the pew, lay his head back, and sleep through the sermon. Right next to Prophet Mother. And he got into trouble with other boys. And he got his little brother Willie into trouble. And she says, Willie is a treasure of God. Look what you've done to him. Was that the best way to parent? No. Ellen White was not a perfect parent. Many of her wonderful writings about parenthood came in later years, after experience and vision as well. In fact, that would be a claw in Edson's side the rest of his life, that comparison with Willie. And years later, in his early 40s, he married a girl that his parents didn't want him to marry, and both James and Ellen wept over his case, and she wrote many letters to him and appealing to him. And when he was 43, he'd had it. He decided he was going to leave Adventism and leave Christianity. He wrote his brother Willie to tell his mother. He was probably just trying to jab a little bit. And of course, his mother went into orbit, as you can understand. She wrote him another lengthy epistle. And it's really interesting the way it's worded. I want to just make sure I read it right here, because it's this letter was handwritten. She had a typist for many of her letters, But certain ones she didn't want others to read, they were handwritten. And there's a little script at the beginning of this letter, and it reads this way. Edson, please read this carefully. Do not set it aside or burn it. Evidently, Edson had burned some of her previous letters. Please don't burn this one. Read it. And she'd had a dream about his experience. She shared it with him. She appealed to him to come back to Christ as only a Christian mother could do. And it moved his soul. It moved him. He gave his heart to the Lord, probably for the first time. A wonderful conversion experience. His first question to that was, what can I do for the Lord? And you know what Edson's great contribution to the church was? At that time, it was a better opportunity to go down to the south. It was a good opportunity, but it was also very challenging at that time too. In the latter part of the 19th century, at any rate, he chose to go down and minister to the black people in the south. And he's the pioneer of the black work. And we have just myriads of wonderful black Seventh-day Adventist Christians in the southern region of the United States that can go back to Edson's ministry during that time. So God used him. And that's a whole other story. I could tell you the trials that he went through and the crew that worked with him during that time. And some of Ellen White's statements about dealing with the black work during that time. It was quite an incredible challenge because the Civil War was over, slavery was over, but racism had come back with a vengeance in the South. And that's some of the circumstances that they were dealing with. But Edson came back to the Lord and played a big role. And then you have Willie, little Willie. Now Willie, he and his mother, Edson and his mother were different personalities. But Willie and his mother were like two peas in a pod. They just worked well together. But little Willie was not perfect. Now at the school in Battle Creek, he didn't like his teacher. A new teacher had come. He disliked the teacher. One day, he stayed by after school and he scribbled a poem he'd been thinking up in his mind on the board. The next morning, all the children and the teacher file into the school and they see this scribbled on the chalkboard. The devil flew east, west, north, and south and picked Miss Jones up in his mouth. But when he saw he had a fool, he dropped her here to teach the school. That's Willie White. Yes, he got in trouble for that. But in general, he was not that bad of a kid. He never got into the trouble that his older brother Edson did. As you see, I put them, I didn't mention this in the picture, but I have. I'll go back to Edson. There's the younger Edson and the elder Edson, and then this is the younger Willie of the story I just told. And now a story about Willie as an elder. He grew up, and when his father died, the Lord showed his mother that he was to be the one to help her with her writings. And he would manage her staff and begin the work of the White estate. But he was one of these people that could go to sleep any place, anytime, anywhere. And one time Ellen was preaching. Very important message. She was sharing from a vision. Willie was sitting in the back. And she noticed smiles in the people's faces, the audience. They were smiling, looking over her shoulder. She paused and she could hear that familiar sound. She turned, beard was on chest, he was gone. She turned back around and everybody thought, oh boys, is he in trouble now? And she says, you know, when Willie was a little boy, or when he was a baby, I used to bring him into the Battle Creek Tabernacle Church when I would preach, because they couldn't be separate from him. And the brethren constructed in that big pulpit a little rocking cradle. And I could put little Willie at my feet. And with my foot, I could rock him. And he would sleep through my entire sermon. Well, as you can see today, brothers and sisters, he's not gotten over that habit. Not lighten things up. And Ellen she enjoyed humor, believe it or not. There's some Adventists, they're so sour, and they think they're getting that from Ellen White. And she was not that way at all. She had trials and had a melancholy spirit, but there was a lot of joy in that woman's life. In fact, I wrote an article in the Review and Herald on Ellen White and joy years ago about her joy. And she had lots of joy and lots of humor. Lots of humor. I'm going to get to that in a minute. I always do this. I get into these stories and I get carried away and I run out of time. Let me walk through her life really quick. Here she is as she aged. Again, there's that with Lizzie. I think I'll just summarize what she said. I was going to read the letter, parts of the letter. But Lizzie was on her deathbed, and she had a little baby that had just died. And Ellen White's appealing to Lizzie to come to Christ. She didn't say to Lizzie, now Lizzie, just start paying your tithe. Or Lizzie, just become a vegan. Okay? Or Lizzie, just join the church and embrace the three. Just start keeping the Sabbath. She didn't say any of that. She said, Lizzie, won't you come to Jesus? She's writing to a woman who's not an Adventist, not a Christian. Just come to Jesus. Jesus will accept you as you are now. He wants to save you. Lizzie, come to Jesus. That captures the evangelical spirit of Ellen White. She understood the gospel. She understood and preached what it means to accept Jesus as your Savior. She understood what it means to be saved by faith and not works. Of course, she believed in faith that works, yes, but the basis of salvation is Christ's works. And so she appealed to her sister to come to Jesus. As far as she could tell, Lizzie didn't accept that appeal. And so years later, when she was asked about Lizzie, she said, I don't expect to see Lizzie in heaven. That's because Lizzie never accepted her appeal to come to Christ. So here she is. This is in the early 1880s. It is 1881 that James died. That was a very difficult experience for her. We could really talk about that, how she handled the grief. Here she is in the spring of 1888. You see her right in the, you can't see I'm doing my laser like I do in my classroom. But she's right in the middle there holding the Bible. Do you know the significance of the year 1888? Do you know what would happen that fall in 1888? Very important general conference, one of the most important general conferences in Adventist history, the conference devoted to righteousness by faith. Because Adventism had spiraled into legalism. And Ellen White had been uplifting the gospel repeatedly, but the leaders of the church and members of the church had spiraled down into legalism. They were trying to earn their salvation, and this conference put them back on the right Christian gospel track. That's summarizing it in a nutshell. All that would happen that year in 1888. And here she is in Australia, where she spent the last decade of the 19th century. That was after 1888. The brethren, there was a lot of conflict during that general conference, and they wanted her out of their hair. And so they sent her to Australia. She didn't want to go, but it turned out to be one of the most productive decades of her life. That's where she wrote all of her books on the life of Christ. That's where she hammered out the Adventist philosophy of Christian education. All of our schools today follow that basic philosophy that she hammered out in Australia. Here is her pet dog in Australia. She named him Tiglath-Pileser, one of the great evil Assyrian kings in the Old Testament. And so that there's a lot of humor behind this. Just to give you an example of Ellen White's humor, I have a number of stories that I tell, but I think I'll just tell one because there's humor in the dog there. When she was coming back from Australia, she'd heard of a group of Adventist believers, Seventh-day Adventist believers that emerged on the island of Samoa, and she wanted to see them. And so they got off the big ship into a smaller boat, and they went up to the shore. And as they came, the hefty Samoan men came out, and she had her daughter-in-law, May, with the little baby. So it was the three of them. And so they first came to Sister White, and these big men put their hands into a chair-like position. And so Ellen got on their hands. They carried her off the beach, put her on a rock. And she's facing the water and watching what happened. So they went back to get May and the baby. One of them took the baby, had a little umbrella to shield the baby from the sun, the heat of the sun. And then the other one turned his sweaty back towards May, her daughter-in-law. She had on the big 19th century dress and what we would call a 19th century dress. And he told her to get on his back. And so she scrambled on his back. And Ellen's watching this scene. And May would write about this years later. She began to slip and slide, and the waves are splashing behind. And she's walking, and she's sliding, and she's trying to hold on for dear life. And Ellen is watching this, and it struck her as funny. And she says, Mother White laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard she fell off the rock. And when they quickly went up to pick her up on the back, when she was laying on her back in the sand, they said she was still laughing. That's a picture I especially like to hold up before our young people. Ellen White was a very serious person, serious about the work of God, but she understood what joy is, and she understood true humor. In fact, in Elms Haven, where she spent the last 15 years of her life, the children in their years later as adults, the grandchildren, they recalled that they often heard her laughing. It doesn't matter where you were in the house, you could hear her belly laugh. And they said sometimes they were outside in the front yard or the backyard playing, and they could hear Grandmother White laughing. During those years, her favorite dessert was lemon pie. Don't let that out of this building, okay? But Ellen White enjoyed a favorite dessert. It was lemon pie. You see, she was down to earth. She was like the rest of us. She had an extraordinary gift, but she was a real human being too. We already know from the Bible, David, for example, that prophets are not perfect. But some Adventists try to make a perfect being out of Ellen White. She floats 3 feet off the ground. That's just not the real story. At any rate, here she is in later life, happy grandmother with children surrounding her and grandchildren, as you can see. Here she is at the dedication of Loma Linda. One of 2 pictures we have of Ellen White preaching. I would have loved to have been in that audience listening to her preach. We actually have recordings of her son Willie, but we don't have anything of Ellen. What it would have been, how neat it would be if we could hear her voice. If we had a recording, historians would love that. Here she is with Sarah McInturfer, her aide who helped her as she got older. Ellen couldn't walk. She was bucked off a horse in the 1870s, and she broke her ankle, so she was never able to walk in later life. She got a little heavy set, so she would ride a lot. She loved the outdoors. And here she and Sarah are riding, and one day she was in Washington, D.C., out in the outdoors, and a big entourage came by, and it was President Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States. This woman had seen angels in vision, and she wrote about in her diary how exciting it was to see the President of the United States a few feet away. Here she is at the 1909 General Conference. To her screen right would be Brother Haskell, who asked her to marry him after James had died, and she tactfully declined. Little personal note there. The 1909 General Conference was the last official General Conference that Ellen White spoke at. And you all recall, of course, that she was at Elms Haven. She was going to her room one day, and she fell and broke her hip. She was bedridden. That was in 1915. She was bedridden for the next 6 months. And then she died in July of 1915. Moving story of her death we won't be able to get into, how she just simply went to sleep in Jesus. Here is the funeral on July 24. There were 3 funerals, 2 in the West Coast, and then the final funeral at Battle Creek, where this picture was taken. You can imagine, look at the amount of people there. You can imagine how they must have felt. Ellen White had been there from the beginning, and now she's gone. What a turning point this was in Adventism. But they had her writings, and we've learned to trust the writings since then. Here is the burial plot. James was buried there, and she was buried next to him. There's a fence that's there now. There's this a Bible in flowers from Revelation. Behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me, Revelation 22:12. A.G. Daniels is one of our most well-known General Conference presidents in Adventist history. He worked many years with Ellen White. A couple of decades after her death, he wrote an important book called The Abiding Gift of Prophecy. And he reflects on her prophetic ministry, her life. And here's what he wrote, and I'll conclude with this. In this present year of our Lord, 1935, Mrs. White has been at rest 20 years, while I have been toiling on. I had 23 years of direct observation of her life work. Since her death, I have now had 20 additional years for thoughtful reflection and study of that life and its fruits. Now, at an advanced age, with the constraint of expressing only sober, honest truth, he was dying of cancer, by the way, and he did die shortly after this. I can say that it is my deep conviction that Mrs. White's life far transcends the life of anyone I have ever known or with whom I have been associated. She was uniformly pleasant, cheerful, and courageous. She was never careless, flippant, or in any way cheap in conversation or manner of life. She was the personification of serious earnestness regarding the things of the kingdom. I never once heard her boast of the gracious gift God had bestowed upon her or of the marvelous results of her endeavors. She did rejoice in the fruitage, but gave all the glory to Him who wrought through her. I realize that these are grave statements, but they come from the deepest conviction and soundest judgment that I'm capable of rendering. They are uttered in the sobering atmosphere of my last illness as I face the Judge of all the earth, before whose presence I realize that I soon shall stand. There's an eyewitness testimony of someone who experienced the life and works of Ellen G. White. Of course, there's much more. There's many things you could read to learn about her. The more we know about Ellen White as a person, I think the better we can appreciate the prophetic gift. Heavenly Father, thank you for this wonderful gift, for this person in which you manifested the gift. May we learn to appreciate this life better and the fruits of that ministry and the writings that we have today. Continue to bless us as we study this gift. In Jesus' name I pray.